When we talk about Batman, two names always come to mind: Bob Kane and Bill Finger. We remember those names because they are important. They are the people who created Batman. But there is a third name, a name that should be mentioned all the time when we talk about Batman. That name is Denny O'Neil. One of the greatest minds to ever work in the American comic book industry. His contributions to the medium are enduring and everlasting, and maybe his greatest achievement was in the Batman comics. For many people, Denny O'Neil is the best Batman writer. He definitely is my favorite Batman creator, and there is good reason for all this recognition. With almost 3 decades of contributions both as a writer and editor, Denny O'Neil is one of the most influential figures in the history of Batman. Unfortunately, on June 11, 2020, Denny O'Neil passed away at the age of 81. This special video is dedicated to his memory, as we take a closer look at his work on Batman and why it rightfully deserves so much appreciation. Denny O'Neil was born in St. Louis, Missouri on May 3, 1939, the same year and the same month that Detective Comics number 27 was released. In other words, Denny O'Neil came to this world on the same year and the same month as Batman, foreshadowing the close relationship between Denny and the Bat.
When I was 6, I loved Batman. I remember him as one of 5 or 6 characters that I really was responding to back then.
By the early 1960s, Denny O'Neil graduated college with degrees on English literature, creative writing, and philosophy. His first professional job was on a newspaper, where he wrote about comics. Around the mid-1960s, Denny found himself working at Marvel Comics, where he started out as a ghostwriter for none other than Stan the Man Lee.
My job was to imitate the guy who was arguably the best comic book writer in the world, Stan Lee.
O'Neil wrote a few titles like Doctor Strange, Daredevil, and even Millie the Model. But after a while he moved to another company called Charlton Comics, where he met with artist and editor Dick Giordano. It was thanks to Dick Giordano that Denny O'Neil started working for DC Comics in the late 1960s. Among his first assignments were Bomba the Jungle Boy and Beware the Creeper, the latter which he did with legendary artist Steve Ditko. Denny also had short runs in Wonder Woman and Superman, but he admitted that he wasn't interested in those characters. He preferred street-level characters over superhumans, and that's why some of his best stories are with characters like Green Arrow, The Question, and of course, Batman. In 1968, the Batman comics were following the lead of the Batman TV show, with campy humor and silly adventures. It was then that Denny was asked to write for Batman.
Julie had asked me if I wanted to do the character, and I wrote a serious Batman story themed on New Orleans jazz. He saved that and he published it eventually.
That story is called Carnival of the Cursed, so obviously it was not campy enough for 1968. It was eventually published in Batman 244 in 1970, because by that time, Batman had changed. This change happened in 1969, when the Batman editor, Julius Schwartz, realized that the camp was going nowhere, and by the start of the 1970s, it was time for a significant change.
We're not going to do this campy Batman anymore. Neil and I will go back to May 1939, and we will do Bill Finger's Batman.
At the start of 1970, Schwartz set the stage for Denny O'Neil to return Batman to his dark origins. Dick Grayson had graduated college and moved out of Gotham, leaving Bruce Wayne alone. With Robin out of the picture, they could go back to the Batman of 1939, and inspired by Bill Finger, Denny brought back the Dark Avenger of the Night. The Secret of the Waiting Graves became the first Batman story published by Denny O'Neil, and it was an outstanding success. Of course, part of that success was due to the art of Neil Adams. The two of them brought back the Dark Batman and modernized it for the new generations. With just one single issue, Denny O'Neil had changed history. Without Denny, Batman wouldn't be the Dark Knight we all know. Denny's first couple of years as the writer of Batman were full of dark stories, with supernatural horror, murder mysteries, and detective adventures. He often worked with Neil Adams, but because he wasn't always available, Denny also collaborated with other artists like Irv Novick and Bob Brown. During one of these collaborations, Denny O'Neil created the League of Assassins and Talia, along with artist Bob Brown. These new characters were introduced because Denny was setting the stage for the next big Batman villain.
As far as Julie was concerned, he said he had this name, Ra's al Ghul. I have never found out where he got it, but he knew what it meant. Head of the demon.
By 1971, the Batman team was ready to introduce the new and most formidable adversary for Batman ever created. Julius Schwartz came up with the name, Neil Adams with the design, and Denny O'Neil with the character and his motivations. Denny was always concerned about social issues. Around the same time, he was also writing Green Lantern Green Arrow, which is one of the most important works in the history of the industry. Denny O'Neil used comics to write about issues that concerned him. He focused on topics like racism and drug addiction, and by being honest about these issues, he brought big changes to the comics and small changes to the world. Among the topics that Denny was always interested in was the environment, the protection of the planet, and the natural ecosystems. He found the perfect way to use these topics in his stories with Ra's al Ghul. Denny had created a supervillain whose actions were not entirely evil, a complex character, someone with whom you can sympathize, even if you don't agree with him 100%. And because of all that, Ra's al Ghul instantly became one of the greatest enemies of the Batman. And to make it even more interesting, his daughter, Talia, became one of the best romantic partners for Batman. And that was only the beginning. Denny used these characters and did something never seen before. The saga of Ra's al Ghul is the first big storyline in the Batman comics, and it takes place over the course of 2 years and over 9 different issues. The story also introduced key elements of the Batman mythos, like Batman's undercover alias of Matches Malone and the Lazarus Pit, where Ra's al Ghul restores his youth. All of those ideas came from Denny, and to finish the story, he gave us the most intense climax ever in the Batman comics. He was able to do all that because to Denny, continuity really mattered. He liked big storylines with consequences, and that would remain true until his last working days as an editor. After introducing Ra's al Ghul to the mythos, Denny decided to bring back the classic enemies. The first one was Two-Face in 1971, who had not appeared in a Batman comic for almost 15 years. And in 1973, after 4 years of absence, Denny brought back the Joker. The Joker's 5-Way Revenge is one of the most important comics in the history of Joker, as it brought back the murdering maniac based upon the original Joker of the Golden Age. And even in this story, Denny remained the true social advocate and managed to include a small thing about pollution, making that the reason why Joker is defeated. Over the next couple of years, Denny brought back the rest of the Rogues Gallery, reintroducing Catwoman, Penguin, Scarecrow, and the Riddler. But Denny soon realized he needed to make the villains believable, and that's why in 1974, Denny created the Arkham Hospital for the Criminally Insane, which nowadays is known as Arkham Asylum. Denny was so close to the Batman villains that he was chosen to write for The Joker, the first American comic book featuring a supervillain. By the mid-1970s, Denny continued writing Batman, but he was not the only writer. Other people came along, and Denny's contributions were reduced. And yet, Denny still managed to produce memorable comics. He wrote the stories where Batman meets the Shadow, the real-life inspiration for Batman, and he dedicated that story to Bill Finger, and I feel like this was Denny's way to show justice for the man who really deserved it. Among his last contributions as a regular Batman writer, Denny created Leslie Thompkins and Crime Alley. By that point, everyone was familiar with Batman's origin, but Denny expanded the story, putting a name to the place where the tragedy happened, and he introduced Leslie, who became a beacon of hope and idealism in Gotham. Leslie is the character that best represents Denny, his ideals and hopes. Through her, Denny voiced his opinions about violence and highlighted real-world problems reflected in Gotham. Leslie showed up again in one of Denny's final stories of his run in Batman. In that story, Denny introduced the character of Maxie Zeus, but most importantly, he included a commentary about domestic violence, and that goes to show that Denny was not only an excellent Batman writer, but extremely socially conscious. After 10 years of writing Batman, Denny wrote his final storyline in 1980. He used the League of Assassins and Ra's al Ghul once again, and he raised the stakes of comic storytelling by having Kathy Kane, the original Batwoman, killed. Suddenly, death was a serious matter in the Batman comics, and that's something Denny continued to believe for his entire career. Following that, in the early 1980s, Denny moved to Marvel Comics, but before leaving DC, he wrote a Christmas special story featuring Batman, which was illustrated by Frank Miller, marking their first collaboration. After his return to DC in the late 80s and during the 90s, Denny wrote a couple of Batman stories, like Shaman, Birth of the Demon, and other more iconic ones like Batman Venom, in which he introduced the Venom drug and the island of Santa Prisca, and there's also Death of Innocents. These stories are loaded with social commentaries, very much like Denny did throughout his career. Just like the Batman, but in his very own way, Denny was a true warrior of justice. One of the most striking things about Denny's style as a comic writer is that he usually liked to take the heroes out of their normal environments. On the Green Lantern and Green Arrow comics, Denny had the heroes travel across the United States, and a lot of Denny's Batman stories happen in remote places, like Alaska, Switzerland, Africa, Spain, Asia, and so on. The first Batman stories he wrote have the hero in New Orleans and Mexico. How many Batman writers can do that and still be called the best Batman writer? I cannot think of anyone, and that speaks volumes. Because the city doesn't make the character makes the character. Denny knew that. He understood Batman like no other person has, and that's why his stories work just as well in Gotham as they do in Santa Prisca.
He is a man who is obsessed, who saw his parents murdered in front of him and has allowed that to shape his life. How useful it is for a writer to work with an obsessed character. And I thought, that's Batman. That's the key to his psychology. You have to change it a little bit because you take it in one direction, and I think it has occasionally been taken there, and you've got a psychopath. You take it in another direction, and you've got a wimp. But if you make him an existential man, a guy who chooses to do what he does because, well, for, among other reasons, there's nothing better he can think of to do with his life.
One of the strongest aspects of Denny's Batman is his characterization. Sometimes a bit blunt and other times too explicit, with many words and dialogue, but always portraying Batman as he should be. Obsessed, yes, but at the same time compassionate, and never extremely violent. Denny understood the character and gave us the definitive version of the Batman that we know today. Without Denny, there is no Batman Begins. The whole Nolan trilogy would not have happened. If Talia didn't exist, there would be no Damian. The Joker, Two-Face, and the rest of the villains would not be what they are today. The Lazarus Pit, Arkham Asylum, Crime Alley, the number of times all these places and characters have appeared in comics, movies, TV shows, and video games, none of that would have been possible. It all happened because of Denny O'Neil. In the early 1980s, Denny went back to work for Marvel, and he wrote for various titles. In Spider-Man, he co-created Madame Web and Hydro Man. On Iron Man, he used his own struggles with alcoholism to write about Tony Stark's relapse. Most importantly, he was also a writer in Daredevil, and later became the editor, collaborating with Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli in one of the most important sagas of the character. By 1986, Denny returned to DC, this time as the editor of the Batman comics, and his first assignment was as co-editor of The Dark Knight Returns. When that turned out to be an enormous success, Denny hired his previous collaborators, Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli, and got them to work on Batman Year One, the definitive origin of Batman. That was quite possibly the best start any editor could have had, and everything that came afterwards was a total success. Denny was responsible for hiring major talent like Alan Davis, Todd McFarlane, Mike Barr, Jim Aparo and Jim Starlin. These were giants of the industry, and Denny got them all working on Batman, creating extraordinary stories. Denny worked with Jim Aparo and Jim Starlin on the landmark storyline A Death in the Family. It was Denny's idea to leave the fate of Jason Todd to the fans, and while the outcome was very controversial, the publicity from that stunt alone gained Batman new levels of popularity, and if it wasn't for that storyline, there would not be a Red Hood. As with all of Denny's stories, consequences mattered, and Jason did not return. Instead, Denny hired Marv Wolfman and worked with him to create Tim Drake, who is considered to be the best Robin. Denny then hired Alan Grant and Norm Breyfogle to become the new Batman creative team. Their run is one of the best ever in the Bat history, with great scripts and extraordinary art. Without them, there is no Anarchy, Scarface, or Mr. Zsasz. For the 90s, Denny hired a group of excellent writers and artists, including Chuck Dixon, Doug Mensch, Graham Nolan, Kelly Jones, and brought them all together with Alan Grant, Norm Breyfogle, and Jim Aparo for the massive storyline called Nightfall. Denny co-created Azrael as the man who would become Batman in Nightfall. That story also introduced Bane, the new and most formidable enemy, who was created using many elements of Denny's Venom story. This mega event took place during a whole year of Batman publications, and it has become one of the classic Batman stories of all time. During the 90s, Denny continued making events involving all the Batman comics. Along with his great creative teams, Denny came up with Contagion, Legacy, Cataclysm, and No Man's Land. These storylines defined the 90s Batman comics, and they required an enormous editorial effort to make them happen. When Denny started editing the Batman books in 1986, there was only Batman and Detective Comics. When he finished his run as editor in the year 2000, there were more than 10 Batman comics in publication, including Legends of the Dark Knight, Shadow of the Bat, Robin, Nightwing, Catwoman, The Batman Chronicles, and more. The Batman editorial group became the largest office at DC Comics. By the end of Denny's long run as an editor, he kick-started the careers of new creative talents like Greg Rucka, Devin Grayson, and Scott McDaniel, among others. Many modern Batman writers like Grant Morrison, Judd Winnick, Scott Snyder, and James Tynion IV have all been influenced by the Batman works, written and edited by Denny O'Neil. And that is the most enduring testament of his legacy in the Batman mythos. Without Denny, none of this is possible. Denny O'Neil returned Batman to his dark and effective origins and gave him back his dignity. He built the modern mythos surrounding Batman and elevated the character to levels of popularity never seen before. The whole industry and the world have been touched by his work. But, at the core, he always considered himself as nothing more than a writer. Someone who could make a difference simply by telling stories. Because for him, that was the highest achievement. That was the only thing he would ask for. Make me laugh, make me cry, tell me my place in the world, lift me out of my skin and place me in another, show me places I have never visited and carry me to the ends of time and space, give my demons names and help me to confront them, demonstrate for me possibilities I've never thought of and present me with heroes who will give me courage and hope, ease my sorrows and increase my joy, teach me compassion, entertain and enchant and enlighten me. Tell me a story.